My dollhouse is missing some trim, so I'm making molds and using clay to replace them. For some of the windows, I can just reattach the broken off trim and fill any cracks and paint over it. But there are 5 windows and I only have the trim for 3 of the windows. I could remove and replace the window trim on all 5 windows so they'll match one another. But instead, I'm making a mold of the wooden pieces I do have using a simple product from Amazon. You could use the same method to replace missing pieces on your own dollhouse or even furniture. I'm starting by removing the windows I'll be repairing. This is the trim I'll be replicating and replacing. There's a flat wooden piece that goes across the top, and that'll be easiest to replace with more wood. There's a center corbel, which is a separate piece from the top trim, and I'll be making a mold of both of these 2 top pieces. This is one of the 3 pieces of window trim I do have. The other 2 I glued onto the dollhouse. I am removing the remnants of the wooden board that I'll later be replacing with wood. I'm using a combination of pliers and a utility knife to separate the pieces so I can make molds. If you run into any stubborn glue, you can use your heat gun or a microwave for a few seconds at a time to soften it. Since these 2 pieces of trim come apart and there's a gap behind the corbel, it's a lot better to make 2 molds rather than try to cast this all at once. I'm using amazing mold putty I got on Amazon, and other similar products would work just as well. I'm mixing equal parts of A and B until it's well mixed with a uniform color. I'm making a mold of the wooden trim at the top first, so I'm making sure the putty is long enough and deep enough. I'm pushing the wooden trim straight down and squeezing the mold up against it to try to get as close to the original shape as possible. You can see I'm pressing the piece of wood into the mold while simultaneously squeezing all of the edges up against it so there won't be any gaps. I'm checking from multiple angles to make sure I can't see the edges of any of the wood trim and continuously squeezing up against it as well. To make the wooden piece level with the top of the mold, I'm putting it down on a flat surface and pressing it down with another flat surface, which in this case is my phone. This is actually my old phone because I have since cracked the screen and broken it. The corbel has an angled piece on the front, so I'm putting the detailed side facing down with the flat side facing up. I'm making sure the putty is in contact with all of the edges because anywhere there's a gap, it'll be a bulge in the mold. I'm leaving both of the molds to dry, which will take about 20 minutes at room temperature. Only 2 of the 3 windows need replacement clay pieces, but all 3 of them need a new board across the top, so I'm removing the old acrylic windows to protect them. I was planning to use a paint scraper to remove the old splintered remnants of the board, but it wasn't sharp enough, so I switched to a utility knife. The blade on the utility knife is thin enough to fit underneath the pieces of wood, and it's also sharp enough to cut them away. X-Acto and craft knife blades can be a little flimsy, so I like to use my utility knife for tougher jobs. To remove this glued board, I made a few passes with my utility knife and it came away easily. If you need to use a microwave, just know all of the glue will weaken, so you may need to dismantle it and glue it back together. I removed the board pieces from all 3 windows and wrote middle, left, and right on the bottom of all 3 so I know where they're located on the dollhouse. Since handmade items can have slight differences, it's best to put them back where you got them. I have a small pile of flat pieces of wood I got in $1 bundles from Earth and Tree Miniatures, so I'm checking the thickness to see if any of them can be used to replace the boards. I lucked out and this piece of wood is the perfect height and thickness, so I don't need to modify it. I found 2 more pieces that are the same size, but one of them is a little thicker than the others, so I'm getting rid of it and finding a new thinner piece. Just in case the windows slightly differ in width, I'm measuring each top board separately and cutting them for the specific window. I'm marking the piece to make sure it gets glued to the correct window. The board attaches to a really small piece of window, and I want to make sure it's flush with the other pieces of trim. Laying the window flat on the table helps make sure the board isn't angled backward or forward. There are small gaps where the board meets the old window, so I'm filling them with some caulk, but you could also use wood filler. Before I fill the little gaps, I'm doing some light sanding. The caulk can't be sanded, so I'm making sure to apply it and wiping it away rather than leaving any lumps or bumps you might sand away later if you use spackle or wood filler. Both of the molds are dry and feel like flexible, firm rubber. For the mold of the corbel, I realized a bit too late that I wasn't careful enough pressing the sides in to make sure it's the appropriate height. This visible white edge shows that the mold isn't as deep as the item I molded. Make sure to give your molds a second look before you allow them to dry completely. Even though the mold isn't perfect, it's still close enough, so I'm filling it with the clay I'll be using to make my castings. I'm using Sculpey medium I conditioned in my pasta roller, but you can use some other kind of clay and condition it with your hands. This clay is firm enough that I can pop it out before baking, and I can see that it already looks great. I made 2 of these and put them on a baking sheet. This mold is a little more complicated, so I have to take a little more time and care filling it and making sure it reaches all of the details. You can bake the clay right in the mold, but since I want to make 2 of them and I want to see how it looks, I pulled this one out before it was baked. It was distorted a tiny bit from being removed before it was baked, but it's still close enough that it looks really good. This is the first time I've tried this, so now that I confirm that it works, I'm putting the clay back into the mold and recasting it. To help the clay hold its shape before baking, I put the entire mold and the clay into the freezer for about 15 minutes. Putting the clay in the freezer helps the clay be a little more stiff so it distorts less when I remove it from the mold. I made 2 of these and baked them with the corbels under aluminum foil at 275 for 30 minutes. Picture these gray pieces of clay painted white, and I think you'll agree they're a pretty good copy of the original. As I'm looking a little closer, I can see a gap between the corbel and the piece of wood trim where there wasn't enough clay. Fortunately, it's easy to fix without making a new piece. To fix it, I'm first adding some liquid clay so the unbaked clay can stick to the baked clay. I'm adding just about the amount of clay that I think is missing. I'm putting it back in the mold and pressing on it so the unbaked clay can take the shape of the mold. You could bake this and smooth it out after, but I'll smooth it before I put it in the oven. I'm smoothing it with my finger and using the edge of the corbel to straighten it. It turns out I made the same mistake on both pieces of trim, so make sure your mold is completely filled. If you find a small hole in a clay item you cast, you can repair it in a similar way by filling it with liquid clay and some unbaked clay. This tiny defect wasn't really worth filling in something that's supposed to be wood, but I just wanted to show you the technique. I baked the pieces again at 270 for 15 minutes, but make sure you follow the instructions on the clay you're using. The cleanup is an important part of the process. I kept comparing the pieces to the originals to see what I need to do. Here you can see this bulges up and it isn't flat, so I'm flattening it out to match the wood. I'm using my utility knife to square off the inside where the corbel goes and also to square off the ends. I spent about 10 minutes cleaning up the pieces in total. I sanded the pieces of trim that go at the top and also the corbels. Sanding the corbels really helped square up the shape to make them look more like the wood. To make sure I have the same amount of show on my corbels, I'm making a line where the paint stops on the wooden version. This is the part of the corbel that sticks up over the trim. I'm using the wooden piece of trim to make sure my board has the same placement as the other windows on the dollhouse. I'm attaching the clay to the wooden board using Zap-A-Gap, which is a really strong super glue. As I was gluing on the clay pieces, I used my pencil guidelines to make sure the board and the corbel position were in the right place. They were especially helpful since I use super glue and it doesn't have a lot of working time. I'm cleaning up extra glue with a piece of scrap wood. At this point, I'm reuniting these wooden pieces with their windows since I no longer need them to make a mold or compare my clay pieces to. Even side by side with a wooden window and no paint, I think this is a pretty good match. I'm giving all of the clay pieces a coat of paint first since they'll require more paint than the wooden pieces. I also want to see if there are any imperfections I need to fix before I give them a final coat of paint. I painted all 3 windows and laid them side by side. The wooden window is in the middle. In place on the dollhouse, the clay pieces blend right in and look a lot better than what we started with.